resumed the other. The shortness of life is our daily complaint, so that this must be a universal law in nature. Alas, cried the Saturnian, few, very few on this globe outlive 500 great revolutions of the sun. These, according to our way of reckoning, amount to about 15,000 years. So you see, we in a manner begin to die the very moment we are born. Our existence is no more than a point, our duration an instant, and our globe an atom. Scarce do we begin to learn a little when death intervenes before we can profit by experience. For my own part, I am deterred from laying schemes when I consider myself as a single drop in the midst of an immense ocean. I am particularly ashamed, in your presence, of the ridiculous figure I make among my fellow creatures. To this declaration Micromegas replied, if you were not a philosopher, I should be afraid of mortifying your pride by telling you that the term of our lives is 700 times longer than the length of your existence. But you are very sensible that when the texture of the body is resolved, in order to reanimate nature in another form, which is the consequence of what we call death, when that moment of change arrives, there is not the least difference betwixt having lived a whole eternity or a single day. I have been in some countries where the people live 1,000 times longer than with us, and yet they murmured at the shortness of their time. But one will find everywhere some few persons of good sense, who know how to make the best of their portion and thank the author of nature for his bounty. There is a profusion of variety scattered through the universe, and yet there is an admirable vein of uniformity that runs through the whole. For example, all thinking beings are different among themselves, though at bottom they resemble one another in the powers and passions of the soul. Matter, though interminable, have different properties in every sphere. How many principal attributes do you reckon in the matter of this world? If you mean those properties, said the Saturnian, without which we believe this our globe could not subsist, we reckon in all 300, such as extent, impenetrability, motion, gravitation, divisibility, etc. That small number, replied the traveller, probably answers the views of the Creator on this your narrow sphere. I adore his wisdom in all his works. I see infinite variety, but everywhere proportion. Your globe is small, so are the inhabitants. You have very few sensations, because your matter is endued with few properties. These are the works of unerring providence. Of what colour does your sun appear when accurately examined? Of a yellowish white, answered the Saturnian, and in separating one of his rays we find it contains 7 colours. Our sun, said the Syrian, is of a reddish hue, and we have no less than 39 original colours. Among all the suns I have seen there is no sort of resemblance, and in the sphere of yours there is not one face like another. After diverse questions of this nature, he asked how many substances, essentially different, they counted in the world of Saturn, and understood that they numbered but 30, such as God, space, matter, beings endowed with sense and extension, beings that have extension, sense, and reflection, thinking beings who have no extension, those that are penetrable, those that are impenetrable, and also all others. But this Saturnian philosopher was prodigiously astonished when the Syrian told him they had no less than 300, and that he himself had discovered 3,000 more in the course of his travels. In short, after having communicated to each other what they knew, and even what they did not know, and argued during a complete revolution of the sun, they resolved to set out together on a small philosophical tour. Chapter 3. The Voyage of these Inhabitants of Other Worlds. Our 2 philosophers were just ready to embark for the atmosphere of Saturn with a large provision of mathematical instruments, when the Saturnian's mistress, having got an inkling of their design, came all in tears to make her protests. She was a handsome brunette, though not above 660 fathoms high, but her agreeable attractions made amends for the smallness of her stature. "Ah, cruel man!" cried she, "after a courtship of 1,500 years, when at length I surrendered and became your wife, and scarce have passed 200 more in thy embraces, to leave me thus before the honeymoon is over, and go a-rambling with the giant of another world. Go, go, thou art a mere virtuoso, devoid of tenderness and love. If thou wert a true Saturnian, thou wouldst be faithful and invariable. Ah, whither art thou going? What is thy design? Our 5 moons are not so inconstant, nor our ring so changeable as thee. But take this along with thee. Henceforth I never shall love another man. The little gentleman embraced and wept over her, notwithstanding his philosophy, and the lady, after having swooned with great decency, went to console herself with more agreeable company. Meanwhile our 2 virtuosi set out, and at one jump leaped upon the ring, which they found pretty flat, according to the ingenious guess of an illustrious inhabitant of this our little earth. From thence they easily slipped from moon to moon, and a comet chancing to pass, they sprang upon it, with all their servants and apparatus. Thus carried about 150 millions of leagues, they met with the satellites of Jupiter, and arrived upon the body of the planet itself, where they continued a whole year, during which they learned some very curious secrets, which would actually be sent to the press, were it not for fear of the gentlemen inquisitors, who have found among them some collieries very hard of digestion. Nevertheless, I have read the manuscript in the library of the illustrious Archbishop of who, with that generosity and goodness which should ever be commended, has granted me permission to peruse his books. Wherefore I promise he shall have a long article in the next edition of Morieri, and I shall not forget the young gentlemen, his sons, who gave us such pleasing hopes of seeing perpetuated the race of their illustrious father. But to return to our travellers. When they took leave of Jupiter, they traversed a space of about 100 millions of leagues, and coasting along the planet Mars, which is well known to be 5 times smaller than our little earth, they descried 2 moons subservient to that orb, which have escaped the observation of all our astronomers. I know Father Castor will write, and that pleasantly enough, against the existence of these 2 moons, but I entirely refer myself to those who reason by analogy. Those worthy philosophers are very sensible that Mars, which is at such a distance from the sun, must be in a very uncomfortable situation without the benefit of a couple of moons. Footnote. This fancy of Voltaire, for it was not a conjecture, was realized in 1877 by Professor Asaph Hall's discovery of this planet's 2 small satellites. End of footnote. Be that as it may, our gentlemen found the planet so small that they were afraid they should not find room to take a little repose, so that they pursued their journey like 2 travellers who despise the paltry accommodation of a village and push forward to the next market town. But the Syrian and his companion soon repented of their delicacy, for they journeyed a long time without finding a resting place, till at length they discerned a small speck, which was the earth. Coming from Jupiter, they could not but be moved with compassion at the sight of this miserable spot, upon which, however, they resolved to land, lest they should be a second time disappointed. They accordingly moved towards the tail of the comet, where, finding an aurora borealis ready to set sail, they embarked, and arrived on the northern coast of the Baltic on the 5th day of July, New Style, in the year 1737. Chapter 4. What befell them upon this our globe. Having taken some repose, and being desirous of reconnoitring the narrow field in which they were, they traversed it at once, from north to south. Every step of the Syrian and his attendants measured about 30,000 royal feet, whereas the dwarf of Saturn, whose stature did not exceed 1,000 fathoms, followed at a distance, quite out of breath, because for every single stride of his companion he was obliged to make 12 good steps at least. The reader may figure to himself, if we are allowed to make such comparisons, a very little rough spaniel dodging after a captain of the Prussian grenadiers. As those strangers walked at a good pace, they compassed the globe in 36 hours. The sun, it is true, or rather the earth, describes the same space in the course of one day. But it must be observed that it is much easier to turn upon an axis than to walk afoot. Behold them, then, returned to the spot from whence they had set out, after having discovered that an almost imperceptible sea, which is called the Mediterranean, and the other narrow pond that surrounds this molehill, under the denomination of the Great Ocean, in wading through which the dwarf had never wet his mid-leg, while the other